Here's something that doesn't add up. For months, the family of Nancy Guthrie was told the ransom notes sent after her disappearance were legitimate, real communication from whoever actually took her. Then, this summer, the FBI came out and said the opposite about some of them. Several of the notes investigators had been sitting on are now classified as extortion attempts, written by people who had nothing to do with the crime. The sheriff running this case and the director of the FBI have spent the last several months publicly contradicting each other about who was actually in charge of the investigation and when.
The department released 2 ransom notes. Why now?
Well, really 2 reasons. One, it's out there. People have been, media has covered some of this, and we just saw what was being said and felt like we need to put something out that's really accurate. I think anybody who reads them, my investigators, we look at it, and clearly there's things in there that are very concerning to our investigative team. So we hope that by releasing the actual note, we'll get some response from the community.
And less than 24 hours before that same sheriff released the 2 most important notes to the public, he sat down for an on-camera interview and said, word for word, that he had no body, no burial site, and nothing indicating Nancy Guthrie was dead.
Is Nancy Guthrie alive, or based on everything that you have right now,
I have nothing to indicate she's dead. I don't have a body, I don't have a burial site, I don't have any note.
The next day, he released a note that said exactly that. Every one of those contradictions is still unresolved right now, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why, 6 months later, the people running this investigation still can't agree on what they actually know. This is the fatal truth, and this is the kind of case that requires more than a headline to understand. So if that's what you're here for, consider this your invitation to sit with us through all of it, and to stay subscribed while we keep digging. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old, living in the Catalina foothills area north of Tucson, Arizona. She was the mother of 3 adult children, including NBC Today show co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, and by every account from people close to the family, she was warm, present, and deeply involved in her grandchildren's lives. She wasn't a public figure by choice. She became one only because of what happened to her, and because her daughter happens to sit behind a national news desk 5 mornings a week. That's worth holding on to, because a case this heavily covered can start to feel like a media story before it's remembered as what it actually is: a family waiting to find out what happened to their mother. On the night of January 31st, Nancy spent the evening at her older daughter Annie's home in Tucson. Investigators say her garage door closed at 9:50 that night, the last confirmed movement anyone's been able to attach to her before things go dark, and I mean that almost literally. At 1:47 the following morning, the doorbell camera at her front door disconnected. 25 minutes later, at 2:12 a.m., the camera's own software flagged that a person was standing in front of it, but because the feed was already down, there's no actual footage of who that was. Investigators believe that 25-minute window is when Nancy Guthrie was taken. Nobody in the neighborhood reported hearing or seeing anything. It wasn't until 11:56 the next morning that relatives arrived at the house and realized she was gone. They called 911 7 minutes later, more than 10 hours after that camera first cut out. Here's a turning point worth flagging immediately, because it shapes everything that follows. Footage that surfaced afterward reportedly shows a masked individual, wearing gloves, a backpack, and what appeared to be a holstered gun, tampering with that doorbell camera in the early morning hours. If that's accurate, whoever did this didn't stumble into an opportunity. They came prepared to take out the one piece of technology most likely to identify them, and they knew precisely where it was mounted. 2 days after the abduction, a ransom note showed up, addressed to Savannah by name. It claimed Nancy was safe but scared, that she'd be held no more than 7 days, and it demanded $4 million in Bitcoin by a deadline that Thursday, rising to $6 million if the family missed it, with a final warning that she'd be killed if the last deadline passed too. The note also described specific details from inside the case: an Apple Watch with a white band left near her bed, a floodlight out at the back of the house. At the time, those details were treated by investigators as reason to take the note seriously, the kind of information, in theory, that only someone with actual knowledge of the scene would have. But here's where this stops being a simple kidnapping for ransom story and turns into something messier. The FBI has confirmed publicly that it received not one or two, but several ransom communications tied to this case over the months that followed, and it has sorted them into three separate categories. Some are considered likely legitimate, some could be legitimate, but don't contain anything that actually proves it. And some have been fully discounted as extortion attempts from people cashing in on a national news story with no connection to Nancy Guthrie whatsoever. In fact, one man has already pleaded guilty to sending a fake ransom note to the Guthrie family, someone who saw a grieving family on national television and decided to profit from it. So before we go any further, sit with that for a second. An unknown number of the messages this family received while praying their mother was alive were sent by strangers who just wanted money, and investigators are still working to sort out which ones actually came from whoever took her. 10 days after Nancy was reported missing, the FBI released that doorbell footage publicly, the masked figure at her door, and within hours, investigators searched a home roughly 60 miles south of Tucson, in the border town of Rio Rico, and detained a man for questioning, a delivery driver named Carlos Palazuelos. He told reporters at the time that he wanted to clear my name, saying flatly, "I hope they get the suspect, because I'm not it." According to his own account and later legal filings, he was held for 7 to 8 hours without being charged, based largely on a tip that he resembled the figure in the surveillance video. He was released. No arrest was made. Months later, his attorney filed a formal legal claim against the Pima County Sheriff's Department, seeking a combined total north of $3 million for Palazuelos and 2 other people swept up in that same search, arguing there was, in her words, no doubt at this point that it was a wrongful search and a wrongful arrest. As of this recording, the department hasn't publicly cleared his name. 5 days after that detention, investigators recovered a pair of gloves discarded roughly 2 miles from Nancy's home, resembling the ones worn by the masked figure on camera, and pulled a DNA sample from them. That's the kind of break that, in a lot of cases, moves an investigation from stalled to solved within weeks. It didn't happen that way here. As recently as this past July, nearly 6 months after the abduction, the Sheriff's Department confirmed that additional evidence, including hair recovered from inside the home, had been tested and still didn't point to a suspect. So by the time the sheriff went on camera and said he had nothing indicating Nancy was dead, his department had already run through a wrongful detention, a DNA sample that hadn't led anywhere, and hair evidence that had just come back as another dead end. That's the environment those 2 ransom notes dropped into. Quick gut check before we go further, because this is the exact point where public trust in this investigation started to crack. Knowing that some ransom notes in this case turned out to be fake, and that federal and local investigators can't even agree on who was slow to respond, do you think the 2 notes eventually released to the public in July are the real thing, or do you think there's still real doubt? Drop a one-word answer, real or doubtful, in the comments, because we're about to walk through exactly why investigators themselves seem split on that question. 4 days after that first note, Savannah Guthrie and her siblings released a video statement, speaking directly to whoever had their mother, saying they'd heard about a ransom letter largely through media reports, and asking for proof Nancy was alive before they moved forward with anything. That detail tends to get lost. The family wasn't just waiting on law enforcement updates behind closed doors. In several moments, they were learning what the public was learning, at the same time the public was learning it. 2 days after that, a second note arrived, and this one reads like something else entirely. It opened with an apology. We did not fully grasp the seriousness of her physical condition, before delivering the line that changed the entire shape of this case. Nancy had died, the note claimed, of what the writer believed was a heart-related medical emergency, and she was, in the letter's own words, buried in nature. It closed by telling the family that nothing they could have done would have changed the outcome, and that the writer hoped they could find peace. And critically, this note dropped the ransom demand entirely. No new dollar figure, no revised deadline, no offer to sell a location, just an apology and a claim of death. A retired FBI supervisory special agent who reviewed the notes for CBS News made a point of flagging exactly that detail, that people motivated by $4 million generally don't walk away from it without a fight, and if one person wrote both letters, something clearly changed for them between the first note and the second. Now here's where the sheriff's own words collide directly with what his department did next. And this is the part of the story that made national headlines for reasons that have nothing to do with Nancy Guthrie's actual fate. Roughly 6 months into the investigation, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos sat down for an interview and was asked directly whether Nancy Guthrie was alive. His answer, on the record, was that he had nothing indicating she was dead. No body, he said, no burial site, and no note. That interview aired on a Thursday. On Friday, the very next day, his own department released both ransom notes publicly for the first time, including the one that said, in plain language, that Nancy had died. He did have the note. He'd had it for months. When reporters pressed him afterward about whether the notes were even valid, his answer was, in essence, that investigators were still trying to figure that out themselves. Sit with that for a second, because it's not a small inconsistency. Either the sheriff misspoke in a way that badly undersold what his department actually knew, or, I don't have a note, meant something more specific and more technical than it sounded like to everyone watching. Neither explanation is particularly comforting if you're the family waiting on this investigation to tell you the truth. And that contradiction doesn't exist in isolation, because for months, Sheriff Nanos and FBI Director Kash Patel have been publicly blaming each other for how this investigation was handled in its earliest, most critical days. Patel has said publicly that local investigators were slow to loop the FBI in, and suggested that delay may have cost the case crucial doorbell camera footage before it could be recovered. Nanos has flatly rejected that account, calling it not even accurate, insisting FBI agents were on the ground from day one, standing beside him at the very first press conferences, and going so far as to call Patel misinformed. At one point, Nanos even noted that the two men, despite running the same case together for 6 months, have never actually met in person. When the head of the FBI and the sheriff leading a joint task force can't agree on the basic timeline of their own cooperation, that's not a minor communication issue. That's a credibility problem sitting right at the center of the investigation the public is being asked to trust. So which is it? A sheriff who was straightforward with the public and simply chose his words carelessly in one interview, or a sheriff who understated what his department knew right up until he had no choice but to release it? And is the FBI versus sheriff blame game a genuine disagreement about how the case was run, or two agencies protecting their own reputations as this case drags past the 6-month mark without an arrest? Neither one of those questions has a confirmed answer. What is confirmed is that both of these threads were happening in the same 72-hour window in late July, right as this case was supposed to be having its biggest breakthrough in months. Let's walk through the crime scene one more time now, but through a different lens. The first pass, we went chronologically. Camera disconnects, person detected, family finds her gone. This time, let's look at what evidence was actually preserved in those early hours, because that's where a lot of this uncertainty seems to trace back to. Blood was found on Nancy's front porch, and it didn't stay contained. It trailed down the front walkway, suggesting a direction of movement away from the house. That's one of the clearest physical indicators in this entire case pointing to which way Nancy was taken. But before investigators fully treated the scene as a likely abduction, that blood evidence was reportedly walked over by responding personnel, by onlookers, and, according to widely reported detail, even by a delivery driver who arrived at the property before it had been properly secured. Separately, the home's back door had reportedly been left propped open, and the doorbell camera housing had visibly been removed from its frame. Two details that, together, suggest an entry point that wasn't treated with urgency in the earliest hours. Hours that, 6 months later, might have been the difference between a note that says, "buried in nature," and an actual confirmed answer. That's really the through line running underneath everything in this case. Every single version of what happened to Nancy Guthrie, the notes, the sheriff's own contradictory statements, the finger pointing between two of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country, keeps circling back to the same handful of hours right after that camera went dark, and 6 months later, almost nothing that happened in those hours has been fully agreed upon by the people investigating it. It's worth pausing here on how the FBI actually became formally involved, because that process is itself part of the dispute between Nanos and Patel. According to public statements from the Sheriff's Department, the FBI was plugged into the investigation the night Nancy was reported missing, with the Violent Crime Task Force, a standing partnership between Pima County and federal investigators, notified almost immediately. Hundreds of agents and support staff were reportedly deployed to the Phoenix and Tucson areas in the case's opening days, but Patel's camp has suggested that formal federal involvement in evidence collection, specifically around that doorbell camera, came late enough that some footage may have been unrecoverable by the time it happened. Sheriff Nanos disputes that account point by point. What's not in dispute is that both agencies were on the ground quickly, and that neither agency has been able to produce a single named suspect in the 6 months since. There's also real disagreement among outside analysts about who actually wrote these notes, and it's worth walking through that debate directly, because it's opinion and professional inference, not confirmed investigative fact. Some forensic linguists who've reviewed the released text believe both letters came from the same author, pointing to matching stylistic quirks. Repeated comma splices, consistent word choices like writing smartwatch as two separate words in both notes, as evidence of one hand behind both messages. One retired FBI agent who reviewed them publicly went further, arguing that the shift between the first note's ransom demand and the second note's total abandonment of that demand reads like someone who started out planning to profit and ended up simply trying to unburden themselves of guilt. Same channel, same habits, same distance from responsibility, as he put it, though he was careful to note that whether that person actually took Nancy or inserted themselves after watching the story unfold on the news remains, in his words, the open question. Other analysts have pushed back on reading too much into either note at all, pointing out that the notes are short, that some of the same phrasing could easily be a translation artifact rather than a genuine linguistic fingerprint, and that with an unknown number of copycat and extortion notes already confirmed to be circulating around this exact case, it's dangerous to build a confident profile off two documents whose authenticity investigators themselves have never fully settled. There's a separate, more forensic layer to this debate too. Some investigators who've reviewed the porch blood evidence have suggested, as a working theory rather than a confirmed finding, that its location and pattern could indicate facial trauma, meaning Nancy may have been struck before she was ever removed from the property. If that theory holds up, it reframes the entire tone of these notes. A note that opens with, "She is safe but scared," reads very differently if the person writing it already knew, at the moment they sent it, that they'd hurt her badly enough to leave blood on her own front porch. That's not a confirmed fact. It's an inference built off physical evidence that was only partially preserved. But it's exactly the kind of detail that widens the gap between what these notes claim and what may have actually happened in that house. And that gap is precisely why the FBI's three-tier system for classifying these notes matters as much as it does. A note in the likely legitimate category, built on real crime scene knowledge, is one thing. A note in the could be legitimate but nothing proves it category is something else entirely, because at that point, investigators are essentially conceding they can't rule out that someone with no real connection to Nancy simply paid close enough attention to the news coverage to fake convincing detail. And a note in the confirmed extortion attempt category, like the one that led to a guilty plea, tells you that at least one person watched this family's public agony and decided it was an opportunity rather than a tragedy. So knowing everything we've walked through now, the FBI sorting an unknown number of notes into legitimate, questionable, and outright fake, a man who's already pleaded guilty to sending a fake one, the sheriff's own on-camera contradiction the day before releasing the real ones, and two of the top law enforcement officials on this case publicly accusing each other of mishandling it. Go back to that first question. Do you think the two notes released this July are genuinely from whoever took Nancy Guthrie, or do you think there's still real reason to doubt them? Tell us which and why, because that's the exact question the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department still haven't fully answered themselves. As of this recording, Nancy Guthrie's case remains open and unresolved. No suspect has been publicly named. No arrest has been made. The reward for information leading to Nancy, or her remains, has climbed past $1 million and does not require a conviction to be paid out. Savannah Guthrie has largely stepped back from public commentary on the specifics of the investigation, saying only that her family cannot be at peace without real answers. And 6 months to the week after Nancy disappeared, both the Sheriff's Department and the FBI issued renewed public appeals for information, tied directly to the release of those two notes. An admission, in itself, that they're still hoping someone outside the investigation recognizes something the investigators haven't been able to pin down on their own. Cases like this one raise questions that reach beyond any single suspect. What happens to public trust in an investigation when the two agencies leading it can't agree, on the record, about their own timeline? What obligation does a sheriff have to be precise with his words when a single interview can directly contradict evidence his department is sitting on? And when a case draws this much national attention, how many extortion attempts and fake confessions does it take before investigators, and the public, stop being able to tell the real leads from the noise? There's a quieter question underneath all of that, too. Carlos Palazuelos spent 7 or 8 hours in custody and had his name and face tied to a national kidnapping case before ever being charged with anything. And 6 months later, he's the one who had to hire a lawyer to try to get his name cleared, not the department that detained him. If that's what accountability looks like for someone the investigation got wrong, it's worth asking what accountability is supposed to look like for whoever they eventually get right. Those aren't questions this video can answer. They're questions this case keeps raising, 6 months in, with no sign of resolving anytime soon. What's certain is this. Somewhere in the hours after that doorbell camera went dark, something happened to Nancy Guthrie that only one person, or possibly more than one, actually knows the truth of. The notes that were supposed to bring investigators closer to that truth have instead splintered into real ones, maybe real ones, and confirmed fakes. The sheriff who told the public he had nothing indicating she was dead had, by his own department's later admission, exactly that. And the family who asked for proof their mother was alive is, 6 months later, still waiting on an answer nobody in this investigation has been able to give them with any real confidence. If you had to bet on it right now, knowing everything you just heard, do you think the truth about what happened to Nancy Guthrie is already sitting in a file somewhere, buried under conflicting statements and fake tips? Or do you think investigators genuinely don't have it yet? Tell us which and why in the comments below. And if you want to be here the moment this case actually breaks, because 6 months of contradictions like this one usually don't stay unresolved forever, go ahead and subscribe. We'll be covering every update the second it happens.